April 10th, 1943. The skies over Europe were a furnace. Clouds of black flak bloomed like poisonous flowers, and German fighters prowled the edges of bomber formations like wolves circling a herd. At 25,000 feet, the air was thin, freezing, and full of death. And then, a sight that made even the most hardened Luftwaffe pilots hesitate. A B-17 Flying Fortress, its nose completely torn away, kept flying. No cockpit glass, no metal frame in front of the pilots. Nothing but raw, rushing air and the stunned faces of the men who should have been dead. The Germans expected a fireball. Instead, they got what looked like the world's most suicidal convertible cruising home over Europe. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress had already become a symbol of American resolve. Conceived in the 1930s, this four-engine bomber was marketed as a plane that could take punishment and keep flying. Even its name was a product of image and myth. A Seattle Times reporter, upon seeing the first prototype bristling with machine guns, called it a flying fortress. Boeing seized the phrase immediately. By 1943, the B-17 was the backbone of the U.S. 8th Air Force in Europe. Each one carried a crew of 10 pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and gunners at nearly every angle. Each one could haul over 4 tons of bombs. And each one, commanders insisted, could fight its way to the target and back without needing fighter escort. That last claim proved tragically optimistic. The Allied strategy of daylight bombing was controversial. The British preferred night raids, blanketing German cities under cover of darkness. Americans, however, believe in precision daylight bombing, striking factories, oil refineries, and transport hubs. In theory, this would cripple Germany's war machine while sparing civilians. In practice, it was slaughter. German fighter tactics were brutally effective. While Allied gunners were trained to expect attacks from the rear, the Luftwaffe learned to strike from head-on, where a bomber's nose offered the weakest protection. And the weaponry they carried, 20mm and 30mm cannon shells, could rip through aluminum like tissue paper. Losses were staggering. On some missions in early 1943, the casualty rate for bomber crews was nearly 30%. To put that in perspective, a soldier in World War I's trenches had about the same chance of survival as a bomber crewman flying a tour of 25 missions. One U.S. general grimly remarked that a tour was not 25 missions, but 25 chances to die. And yet, within this storm of steel, legends were born. On that April day, one B-17 was hit head-on. A burst of cannon fire ripped away the entire nose section. The bombardier and navigator compartment simply ceased to exist, blown into the freezing slipstream. The pilots, sitting directly behind that vanished nose, suddenly found themselves exposed to the open sky. There was no windshield, no protection, nothing but the slipstream slamming into their faces at nearly 200 miles an hour. Imagine driving down a highway at full speed with your head stuck out the window. Only the highway is 25,000 feet up. The air is minus 40 degrees, and bullets are still flying. That was the cockpit of the B-17 now. The wind roared so loud that crew members could barely hear each other scream. Oxygen masks were ripped from faces. Charts, pencils, and even sidearms were torn away, sucked out into the frozen blue. The pilot's eyes watered constantly from the blast, and frost began to form on his eyelashes. His hands, already stiff from the cold, shook on the control yoke. His co-pilot tried to help, but even simple communication required desperate gestures. And yet the bomber stayed in the sky. German fighters swarmed around it, circling. One later recalled being so astonished, he didn't even open fire immediately. He simply stared at this impossible machine, nose ripped off, pilots exposed to the heavens, and still lumbering on. To shoot it down seemed almost redundant, like trying to kill something that had already died. Another German pilot quipped bitterly that bringing down 4 fighters was easier than finishing off a single B-17. The rest of the crew huddled in the rear compartments, unaware at first of the true extent of the damage. When word spread that the nose was simply gone, some refused to believe it. No plane can fly without a face, one gunner muttered in disbelief. But they kept manning their stations. Waist gunners scanned the skies for Messerschmitts. Tail gunners reported incoming fighters. The radio operators sent frantic messages home. The conditions inside the cockpit were beyond human endurance. The temperature at that altitude could sink to -40. The pilots, fully exposed, had to keep their oxygen masks pressed to their faces while frostbitten winds tore at their skin. Later, ground crew members described the pilot's face as burned raw by ice. One navigator, half frozen, held on to his charts like a lifeline, only to watch them whip away in the gale. And yet, mile by mile, the flying fortress clawed its way back toward England. When it finally descended toward its base, ground crewmen raced the field, expecting to see a burning wreck. What landed instead was a skeleton of a plane, gaping hole where its nose should have been, still rolling on its wheels as if nothing were amiss. Mechanics swarmed over it, stunned. "My God," one muttered, "how are they still alive?" The bomber had returned looking like a corpse, but inside were men, frostbitten, bruised, half-deaf from the roar of the wind, but alive. The image was seared into memory, a flying fortress stripped of its face yet not of its soul. It was as if the machine itself had refused to accept death. Later, stories circulated through the mess halls. "She came back without a nose," crews whispered, half in awe, half in laughter. A joke even spread. If Boeing built coffins, the dead would climb out of them. The story of the noseless B-17 was not an isolated miracle. It was part of a growing legend, a collection of tales about bombers so battered they should have fallen, but somehow clawed their way home. For the Germans, the sight was demoralizing. For the Americans, it became proof that the flying fortress really lived up to its name. And yet, as incredible as this tale seemed, it was only the beginning. Because what came next blurred the line between steel, survival, and myth. The story of that noseless B-17 could have ended as a single strange incident, a freak accident of physics and luck. But as the war dragged on, reports of crippled flying fortresses limping home piled up until they no longer seemed like outliers, but the foundation of legend. What happened on April 10th was shocking, but it was not unique. It was the beginning of a pattern that both amazed Allied crews and bewildered the Luftwaffe. The Germans had built their tactics around efficiency. To them, a bomber without a nose or with its fuselage torn open should have simply fallen out of the sky. And yet time and again, they watched in frustration as these mangled hulks of aluminum refused to obey the laws of aerodynamics. Luftwaffe pilots would circle a fortress, riddled with holes, smoke trailing, engines sputtering, and still see it clawing forward toward the channel. It seemed less like a machine and more like a stubborn beast that refused to die. One case often retold among veterans was of a B-17 that returned with half its tail missing. A 20mm shell had blown away the vertical stabilizer and part of the horizontal surfaces, leaving the rear section flapping violently. The tail gunner clung to what remained of his station, convinced every shudder would be the last. Yet somehow, the pilots fought the controls, compensating with brute strength, dragging the wreck across hundreds of miles back to England. When they landed, ground crews stared in disbelief. A sergeant muttered, "That shouldn't have flown. Hell, that shouldn't have rolled downhill, let alone across Europe." There was also the famous case of the All-American, a B-17 struck during a raid over Tunisia in 1943. An enemy fighter had collided with it midair, slicing almost entirely through its fuselage. The bomber's tail section was nearly severed, held by little more than a sliver of metal and electrical wiring. Photographs later taken on the ground showed daylight pouring through the gap, the back half of the plane visibly sagging. And yet, with 9 terrified men aboard, the pilot nursed it across the Mediterranean and brought it home. When the crew staggered out, one gunner supposedly remarked, "She was held together by faith and chewing gum." These stories circulated among bomber groups like folk tales. Crews would whisper about the planes that came back missing wings, or flying with only 2 engines, or landing without landing gear. They were grimly funny, too, because for every plane that limped home, dozens more never made it back. The statistics were brutal. In 1943 alone, the 8th Air Force lost over 2,000 B-17s. On the October 14th raid on Schweinfurt, 60 out of 291 bombers failed to return. That was more than 600 men gone in a single day. One historian later wrote that serving in a bomber crew in 1943 was the closest thing America had to a suicide mission. And yet the myth of the indestructible fortress kept morale alive. Crews clung to the stories as proof that survival was possible. Pilots told each other, "If one plane can make it with its nose gone, then we can make it with just a little damage." In that way, these bizarre episodes became a kind of shield against despair. Testimonies from surviving crews only strengthened the myth. One co-pilot recalled being drenched in hydraulic fluid, his vision blurred, his face frostbitten by the slipstream after the nose was blown away. He admitted later he had no idea how they survived. Another navigator wrote in his diary that his maps had been sucked into the wind, leaving him blind, and yet somehow instinct and luck carried them home. Ground mechanics spoke in awe, touching the jagged holes in fuselages, sticking hands through openings wide enough for a man to crawl through. Some even collected fragments of shrapnel from inside the plane as souvenirs, tiny tokens of survival against impossible odds. Even the Germans admitted their frustration. A Luftwaffe officer once said, "It was easier to bring down 4 fighters than a single fortress." The words carried a bitter respect. German pilots knew their weapons could shred aluminum, but they also knew that somehow, inexplicably, these bombers would not quit until gravity finally dragged them down. More than once, they watched in disbelief as a burning fortress veered away, smoke trailing, only to vanish into haze, heading west toward the Channel. It was as though the Atlantic itself pulled these machines home. Of course, not every miracle had a happy ending. Some bombers did make it back across the Channel, only to crash near their bases, too damaged to complete even the last mile. Pilots died with runways in sight, the cruelest of fates. But those that landed, those that defied the odds, became legends carved into memory. One humorous aside comes from a ground crewman who, upon seeing yet another wreck staggering with massive holes in its fuselage, reportedly said, "If Boeing built coffins, the dead would climb out of them." It was a joke, but it carried a truth. The resilience of the B-17 bordered on supernatural, and everyone who served around them felt it. Beyond the humor and awe, these stories carried a deeper emotional weight. For the men who flew them, survival often meant the difference between despair and determination. They went up again and again, knowing the odds, but carrying with them the knowledge that maybe, just maybe, their plane would be the one to bring them back alive. For the Germans, the effect was the opposite. The sight of a mutilated bomber, refusing to fall so doubt. If these machines could not be killed easily, then what hope was there of stopping the endless tide of them crossing into the Reich? The myth of the indestructible flying fortress became part of the ideological battle of the skies. Allied propaganda highlighted the stories, publishing photographs of crippled planes that had returned. Newsreels showed battered fortresses limping home, proof for the folks back home that America's machines and men were unstoppable. Families clung to those images with desperate hope, believing their sons, too, might find a way back no matter the odds. The reality was harsher. Thousands never did, but myth and fact intertwined, shaping how the war was remembered. To this day, museums preserve B-17s as symbols not just of technology, but of willpower, endurance, and sacrifice. Veterans, when asked, often struggle to explain how some planes survived. It wasn't engineering, one gunner said years later. It was stubbornness. The plane didn't want to die, and neither did we. What the Germans saw that day in April 1943 was more than a crippled bomber defying physics. It was a glimpse into the essence of the air war. Machines pushed to their limits, men tested beyond endurance, and a stubborn refusal to quit even when everything said they should. That image, pilots exposed to the freezing heavens, still steering a headless plane toward home, became more than just a story of survival. It was a metaphor for the war itself, for the countless times men stood in the face of the impossible and refused to bow. And so the noseless B-17 became part of a larger tapestry, a legend stitched together from steel, fire, and frost. It was one of many tales told in the mess halls and remembered decades later, long after the roar of those engines had faded from the skies. For the men who lived it, for the Germans who watched it, and for the generations who hear it now. It remains a reminder of what can endure when reason says it should not. When that battered fortress rolled onto the runway, frost still clinging to the pilots' faces, the war did not change course overnight. The bombings continued, the casualties mounted, the Luftwaffe fought on. But something deeper shifted. The men who witnessed it knew they had seen more than just a plane. They had seen the stubbornness of steel, the defiance of flesh, and the refusal of hope to die. And in that, perhaps, lay the real power of the flying fortress. Not in its guns or its engines, but in the unyielding spirit it seemed to embody.